Good morning, afternoon, or evening, ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you're tuning in from across the world. Welcome to a Payments, Cards and Mobile webinar in association with our sponsor Inform and etc. I'm Alex Rolfe, the Managing Director of Payments, Cards and Mobile, and I'll be hosting the webinar today. I hope you're doing well and coping with whatever version of lockdown you're currently in. We look forward to seeing you all at a live event in the very near future. A couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Firstly, if you experience any technical difficulties with sound or visual, please use the user interface to ask for help, and one of the team will be with you right away. This is a live event, and we will have a live Q&A session at the end. However, please do feel free to send your questions in as we go along. If your question relates to a specific slide, just make sure you note that down, and then it means we can quickly reference back that slide whilst answering your question. This webinar will contain two separate polls, and we strongly encourage you to participate with those as a bit of engagement, and the findings will be shared with you in the duration of the webinar. And finally, all assets regarding this event will be made available at the end of the show, meaning you can share with your colleagues or review the information again at your leisure. Okay, so as we're able to take stock of the last 12 months or so, it's pretty well documented that there has been a terrific shift to digital. Thankfully, for the majority of us in the payments industry, this has had a positive effect on our businesses. But as more and more people move online, it would be a failure to not acknowledge the risk and fraud elements of that move online, as well as the regulatory changes that are in place and being brought in to manage the issues. So the basis of today's webinar is to address just that, how to turn regulatory challenges into opportunities through an intelligent end-to-end risk management approach. And here to walk you through these topics are two gentlemen who are experts in their field and the subject matter. So I'd like to introduce Roger Burkhardt, Senior Product Manager, Secure Digital Payments at NetCetera, and Marcus Navratil, Senior Consultant, Risk and Fraud Division at Inform. Roger, welcome.
Thanks, Alex. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah, loud and clear.
Great. Thanks for the introduction, and also from my side, a very warm welcome to the audience. I'm happy to present today in this webinar. So I will directly jump to our first poll, as announced from Alex, and to know a little bit better to whom we are talking to in this webinar. And I will soon start the poll with our first question, which is, what role does your company play in e-commerce? You can give multiple answers on that poll question, and we have prepared some answers. 1 is risk provider, 2 is merchant, 3 is acquirer, 4 is bank or issuer, and 5 is a payment service provider. So I will start the poll, and then you have time during the webinar until we then come to the Q&A session at the end. And before the Q&A session, we will then publish the results to the audience so that you also can see the results. So I will start the poll for this question right now. Okay, so you have the chance now to give your answers on this poll number 1. And then I think we are ready to jump and dive into the topic of today's webinar and short to see what it's all about. I have prepared a short agenda. So we will start with the challenges. So what we consider as the biggest challenges in today's e-commerce, then we will present our way to go. So what we see as important today in e-commerce, and then we come to the key findings of today's webinar, and then a short information about who we are, so Inform and etc. And at the end, we hopefully have enough time then to answer on all or part of your questions that come in during the webinar. So let's have a look at the challenges in e-commerce today. So we consider one of the biggest challenge is to combine opposed requirements and regulations. So we all know since PSD2 by beginning of this year came into force, The PSD2 changed a lot for e-payments, and especially in regards to the part of strong customer authentication. It's also clearly stated in PSD2 that there are exemptions to avoid strong customer authentication, and this is where the card schemes come in, because they have a complete opposed requirement, especially to issuers, but also to acquirers when it comes to frictionless transactions. So they expect from acquirers and issuers to make use of PSD2 exemptions, as many as possible. So it's quite an opposed requirement situation for acquirers and issuers. The next challenge we identified is to combine the different technical levels and channels within the payment ecosystem. So in regards, for example, to 3DS, so there is still the old 3DS 1.0 protocol in place for a certain time. It looks like it will remain at least for one more year in the market, but in the meanwhile there is the new 3DS 2.0, 2.1 and 2.2 standard in place, so it's not easy for the industry to combine these technical protocols all in one stream. And on the other side, since the introduction of the 2.x 3DS standard, that also came a new possibility by adding new channels, such as the app channel, to the payment part, and which enabled the so-called in-app purchases. So there is also the challenge to combine these different channels for e-payments. Furthermore, of course, all participants in e-commerce are striving for a smooth process for all stakeholders, and as well as to try to balance convenience, risk, and trust, which is definitely not always easy to do, to find the right balance between these challenges. And last but not least, I think we consider it as very important that all industry players in e-commerce should take or have to take an active role, and also to share responsibility on the process, and also to share liability, of course, in case of fraud. When we have a deeper look into PSD2 in regards to PSD2 exemptions especially, and also in combination with the risk part, then I think Article 18 of PSD2 is maybe the most relevant one that we identified. It's all about the transaction risk analysis part, the so-called TRA exemption. And the TRA exemption can be used by acquirers as well as by issuers. So both can make use of this exemption to avoid strong customer authentication. There are two preconditions to make this possible. So one is to have a risk assessment in place, and which must result on a low risk outcome. So this is a precondition that the transaction is declared as low risk. The second precondition for making use of the TRA exemption is the so-called ETV, the exemption threshold value. And this value is based on the acquirer's or the issuer's fraud rate. So the issuers and acquirers have to calculate their ETV to make use of the TRA exemption. So the purchase amount of a transaction needs to be below this ETV value so that the TRA exemption is allowed to be used. But when we read more in PSD2, so there are already also clearly stated exclusions when TRA exemption cannot be used, and this is in case of, for example, abnormal spending or behavior pattern of the payers. TRA can also not be used in case of an unusual information about payer's device or the payer's software. Furthermore, the TRA exemption cannot be used in any case of malware infection in the session. Also not in case, of course, of known fraud scenarios. Furthermore, not in case of an abnormal location of the payer, and also not in case of a high-risk location of the payee. So all these exclusions must be detectable by a risk assessment. So this is the risk part that is the basic of making the TRA exemption usable. Okay, then we already come to our second poll. So I would like to ask the audience again to give us answers on our second questions, to know a bit more where you have your greatest challenges right now today, or let's say in the upcoming months. Again, here multiple answers are possible, and we have prepared some answers for you. Number one is complying with the regulations. Number two answer is balancing security and user convenience. And the answer number three is providing secure and compliant two-factor authentication methods. Number four is increasing the rate of frictionless transactions. And number five is reducing e-commerce fraud in general. So I will start also this second poll now. And again, for those who are not yet ready and will maybe join a little bit later to the webinar, we will leave this poll open until we come then to the Q&A session, and we'll publish the results on both of the polls to the audience before the Q&A session. Okay, then let's come back to the challenges. So now we want to focus more on the individual players in e-commerce, and I would like to start with the merchant side. And what are the merchant challenges right now today in e-commerce? Maybe we can start with a very important point, which is the identification, or let's say the authentication of users on the merchant side. As we know, most of the merchants are still using username and password for merchant logins, but we also know that this is maybe not the securest way to identify the users on the merchant side. So there we see upcoming technologies that need to help merchants to better authenticate their customers. And one technology that this is coming up, I think in very near time, is this delegated auth, which is normally based on the FIDO technology. But there are other upcoming technologies such as secure SRC, secure remote commerce, that is also aimed then to support and help for a secure guest checkout process. So there are definitely things that are helping merchants in the future to better authenticate their users. But on the same time, I think it's very important for merchants to also convince their customers to enroll for these new technologies. So either it's for delegated auth or for SRC, it's always needed that customers enroll themselves and subscribe to a certain new technology, and this is definitely something merchants need to take care of and really convince the customer to enroll for such new technologies. So merchants need to keep their cardholder informed about these upcoming new possibilities. And last but not least, we also see a challenge for merchants that they should trust more to share data, especially also to share customer data with the stakeholders. And the stakeholders are, of course, the acquirers and the issuers, and that acquirers and the issuers receive more data from the merchant side to also improve their risk assessment part, which then, of course, is again the base to have a leaner and more frictionless payment process. Let's have a look on the acquirer side. So what are the acquirer challenges? And as we have heard, so Tra exemption is a big topic. It's not only for issuers, but especially also because it can be used by acquirers. So the Tra exemption is a challenge how they can enable it on the acquirer side. It's not only in general to one of the most important decisions whether to send a transaction to the issuer's authentication or directly be allowed to do a direct authorized transaction. We see it as necessary that acquirers look to talk to merchants and PSPs directly and coordinate such enablements directly with the merchant and PSP side, because the complexity, especially in regards to TRA, is that, as we have heard, the ETV, so the exemption threshold value, comes from the acquirer based on the acquirer's fraud rate. But from a technical point of view, the enablement of the TRA exemption needs to take place before 3D Secure comes into place. And so that means there they need to coordinate with PSPs, because normally on PSP side the 3DS system is the 3DS works on PSP side, so acquirers and PSPs should coordinate with certain tools to make the TR exemption usable. A further topic for acquirers is definitely the how to link authentication and authorization data streams. We know that, especially from the 1.0 3DS protocol version, that this is one of the, let's say, biggest missing things within the protocol is a unique identifier between the two data streams of authentication and authorization, and this makes it really hard in systems to clearly match data from authentication to authorization. The good thing is with the 2.x 3DS standard protocol, this problem was somehow solved, not 100%, but it's much better, because the schemes, they include when the transaction goes through the directory server of a certain scheme, and they include the directory server ID into both of the data streams. So also in authentication and also in authorization, the same directory server ID is used. So that, and this helps really a lot on both sides, on acquirer and on issuer side, to match these two data streams. Of course, the acquirer, they have the challenge to do fraud prevention. On the one side, they do it for merchants. That means they prevent merchants from fraudulent transactions and fraudsters that are trying to fraud merchants. But also, on the other side, the acquirers prevent themselves from fraudulent merchants. So I think this is our two challenges on that side for acquirers. Okay, so let's have a look on the issuer side, which is not less important, of course. Here again, the big topic is the authentication of cardholders. I think this is the most reason for fraud is still that the transactions where the cardholder is not authenticated, they of course have much more fraud than when a transaction goes through the authentication step at issuer side. And here, of course, we see it as absolutely necessary today that issuers are working with a risk-based authentication approach. Means they have a risk assessment connected to their authentication ACS system. A further problem, which goes a bit more in the detail of the 3DS protocol, is that the new 2.x protocol, 3DS protocol standard, of course, has a flag within the protocol that says whether the acquirer wants to use an acquire exemption, but they cannot differ based on that flag whether the acquirer wants to use a TRA exemption or a low value payment exemption, for example. So I think this is something that can be improved in a further 3DS version, so that the issuers have more detail about which acquire exemption the acquirer wants to apply. Again, the same situation also on issuer side. Also, the issuers have the problem that lots of transactions based on 3DS 1.0 lack of the information of a unique identifier, which makes it hardly impossible to match data between authentication and authorization. So this is the same as for issuers. The very important point, and we hear more on that later on also from Marcus, is how to enhance data in the authorization stream. Because when we compare the authentication and the authorization data stream, then there is much more data available for authentication than for authorization. So when it comes later on to an authorization, the issuers really are lacking of a lot of information that was available in authentication, and we later on will show two different approaches how to improve this situation on the issuer side. Last but not least, here also I think it's important that also the issuers keep their cardholder informed. Means that they show how strong customer authentication must be done or works, and also why it sometimes comes to a strong customer authentication, and in some cases there is no CA needed. Of course, in the background that normally it's the risk part that is forcing this behavior, but I think there the issuers can really help the cardholders to understand how the e-payments work today. Okay, then I think we can already proceed with the way to go. And hereby I want to start with, let's say, the four main points that we have identified as important. Point one is really that the industry should aim for an end-to-end risk management approach. Point two here is that we see that it's necessary to make use of the variety of data. So not only data that is maybe in the protocol, we hear also more later on that. So use as much as possible the data that is available. The third point, of course, very important, is how to share information between authentication and authorization. And the last point here, of course, is to make use of real-time and smart risk fraud solutions. And we see this is a must, and for acquirers, of course, merchants and issuers as well. Let's have a look on the big payment picture in regards to this end-to-end risk management approach. So, of course, it starts at the buyer, at the card holder, when visiting a merchant page, a web shop. And as we have heard there, it already starts with certain authentication improvements, such as delegated authentication or SRC, to clearly identify and authenticate the users already on the merchant side. Next, we see it as a must then on the merchant web shop directly to do the first risk assessment. So every user normally or the merchant can build a profile already on merchant side from the customer, and to check in case of revisit whether it is the same customer, comes from the same IP, and we hear also more on the risk insights later on from Marcus on that. When it comes to an e-payment that is sent to the acquirer, and there we have a common product informant, etc. It's called e-com exemption advisor. It's kind of the pre-3DS check authentication for acquirers. Here, of course, acquired TRA exemption is implemented, but also low-value payment based on a risk assessment. And this is exactly this tool to where acquirers, let's say, can decide whether a transaction needs to go to 3DS or can be exempted with a PSD2 exemption and can be sent directly to authorization. In case no exemption can be applied, of course, it comes to 3DS. So PSD2 is saying yes, and when you cannot apply a PSD2 exemption, the transaction needs normally to go to strong customer authentication. And so the transaction will be forwarded from the acquirer to the issuer, to the issuer's ACS, to the access control server, which is also connected to Inform's Risk Shield, to the risk engine, to do the risk-based authentication part. Based on the outcome of the risk, the ACS then decides whether to challenge the cardholder with strong customer authentication or to do frictionless transactions. And within that, again, the issuer then has the chance or the possibility to make use of the issuer exemptions. One example here is, for example, the merchant whitelisting, where issuers can also avoid strong customer authentication based on exemptions. In case the authentication ended successfully, then the second data stream starts again from the merchant side. The transaction is sent to the acquirer's authorization system, where the fraud check happens. So again, this is based on a risk assessment to check for fraud, and the same thing then happens afterwards one more time on issuer side to go through the authorization fraud check before the transaction is finally accepted or not. And so the important message is that we see as a massive improvement, or there's a high potential for improvements for when this continuous risk data flow could be established between all these parties. That means to really extend the data flow between these parties as much as possible, so that every player provides the data further to the next player, so that they can profit from that and make better risk assessments to also make better usage of PSD2 exemptions to increase the number of frictionless transactions. Let's have a closer look to the authentication shortly on the acquire side. So how this Tra exemption in reality can be used and work. So as I said, there are two preconditions. One is the risk assessment that needs to result on low risk, and the purchase amount is below the ETV. So then we have the green path where the acquirer can use the TRA acquire exemption. In the negative case, so whenever risk detects suspicious behavior and results on high risk, then the transaction needs to go to 3D Secure. Of course, 3D Secure on issuer side can then again decline the transaction, or can also make use of strong customer authentication, or can use also PSD2 issuer exemptions. In regards to liability, it's very clear. So whenever the acquirer uses an acquire exemption that goes directly to authorization, then the acquirer remains liable for these transactions. In case the transaction went through 3DS on issuer side, the issuer gets liable for disputed transactions. Now we look to the other side, to the issuer side. So how issuers doing RBA, so the ACS in combination with a risk engine. We see on the left side the ACS that is provided from etc. On the right side, the risk shield component, the risk engine from Inform. And then we'll shortly go through the process with you when it comes to an authentication on that system. So the ACS receives a request for payment authentication, and what the ACS is doing is the ACS transfer all the data that comes within the protocol. So the 3DS protocol passes all the data to RiskShield, because as I have mentioned, we are convinced that the more data available for the risk assessment, the better, and the higher the accuracy of the risk assessment can be done. So of course, number 3, the RiskShield is performing the risk assessment and gives back the results, so the advice or the score, whatever, from RiskShield to ACS. And based on the customer specific configuration on the ACS and based on the outcome of risk, then the ACS decides how to further process the transaction. Could be end up in a frictionless transaction, could be end up in a challenger, or also in a direct deny of the transaction. At the end, of course, the ACS passes back and transfers back the result of the authentication back to RiskShield, and RiskShield injects the results again into the profiles of the respective cards, because this is very important, so that RiskShield also is informed about the outcome of the authentication, because the more results of past transactions are available, the better the accuracy also for future transactions can be done on the risk side. So we are already kind of deep diving in the risk part, and that's the point I would like to pass over to Marcus to have a deeper insight into the risk world. Marcus.
Yeah, thank you very much, Roger. So I'm going to talk a bit about what kind of data we actually looking at in the context of 3DS protocol, and later on also how to integrate that data between the authentication and the authorization process. And in the end, I will quickly explain then what role Risk-Shape plays in that context, and how Risk-Shape can facilitate this integration process. So regarding the available data, you may all know that with the introduction of the 3DS protocol version 2, a lot more data elements are available now. You have information like shipping address, billing addresses, IP addresses, device fingerprints, whatever you can think about available on this data stream, and all this information is obviously available for risk analytics. And on top of that, the protocol 2 also supports native app in-app purchases, where you have additional information about the involved devices available, and also other use cases like non-payment authentications and merchant-initiated transactions are supported, which can also play a role in all this risk analytics. The overall objective, what Roger said before, is in the end is to combine transactional data from different channels. So in particular, we are talking about integration of authentication data into the authorization processing stream later on. But also you can imagine what is probably usual setup in the authorization stream, that you have cardholder and card master data available for fraud fraud scoring, and also for case investigations. You can imagine the same thing also in the authentication stream. So as an example, you can imagine that you can compare the shipping addresses that come via the 3DS protocol 2 with the cardholder addresses that you have on your files at the issuer end. And as Roger said before, the crucial point here is that the stakeholders really share the data amongst each other, so that the data is coming from the merchants via the payment gateways into the 3DS flow, and also that you can forward such information then into the authorization stream. And all this will then optimize the overall authentication and authorization process. In the next step, I would like to give you some examples or some use cases, what kind of information you can actually use from the authentication in the authorization stream, or also the other way around. So the first use case is basically about the scoring and the authentication results that are coming from the RBA channel, which you can forward to the authorization channel. So all the results from the scoring itself, the applied rules, indicators you calculated there, and also the authentication result, whether a transaction was actually frictionless in the end or successfully authenticated, and also for the EA, the outcome of the PSD2 exemption check. All this information can be forwarded to the authorization for rule building, but also for reporting purpose in the end. A second interesting use case is about what we call missing data. So imagine, for example, the non-successful risk-based authentication attempts. You never see them in the authorization usually, because no authorization is triggered. So, but if you want to get the full picture of a merchant, for example, such who's currently under attack, you may be interested in these non-successful attempts also in the authorization. And on top of that, you may also think about non-3DS transactions or acquirer exempted transactions. So acquirer exempted transactions you may not see on the issuing end if the acquirer doesn't send them over to you. Or the non-3DS transactions for the merchants may be very interesting also for frequency analysis on the authorization stream. Although in combination with the 3DS transactions. And as a last point there, you may also want to think about non-successful authorization attempts, which usually in the usual setup you don't see in an authentication setup whether a transaction finally ended up in a successful authorization or not. And especially on the acquiring end, it's pretty straightforward to implement the whole process in a way that the payment gateway gives the RBA engine the final authorization response code also in the interfaces. And the last use case is then really about correlating data from the different channels. So you can, first of all, you can imagine correlating geolocation information which is derived from the IP addresses for card not present business and compare that one to the POS locations for the card present business. So you can determine cross-channel region conflicts which you were never able to detect before without this geolocation information from the authentication stream. Next to that, when you're thinking about the dynamic linking requirement, where you have to compare transaction amounts between the authentication and the authorization, and when you have to calculate deviations, it is pretty straightforward if you just forward authentication information to authorization, that you can do these checks for deviations directly on your authorization fraud prevention systems. And last but not least, very importantly, you can think about sharing fraud flags or fraud suspicion flags between different channels. So, for example, fraudulent trials in the authentication streams which never show up in the authorization. Such fraud flags are very valuable in the authorization stream if you want to understand which merchants are currently under attack. And the other way around, also the authorization fraud suspicion flags which are coming from your investigations, no matter whether they are coming from POS and ATM business or from e-commerce business which could be 3DS or non-3DS business, are valuable in the authentication stream. In the next step, I would give you a quick overview on how you can integrate such information flow. So you see here an setup with an ACS and a restricted RBA instance with the communication Roger explained before, and on top of that, just an issuing authorization host system sending authorization data, fraud data, master data, whatever you can imagine, to another, for example, restricted issuing authorization fraud prevention instance. And the idea here is after the whole authentication flow is done and you know whether the authentication was successful or not, or whether it was frictionless, you can forward this information. On the one hand, you can do it with an etc. so-called transaction notification web service, which just sends the information directly to the issuing authorization instance, so fraud prevention system, or you can also forward this information from one risk-shield RBA instance to another risk-shield authorization instance. This is the setup with two different risk-shield implementations, and where you are pretty, from an architecture point of view, you are pretty free where those instances are hosted. From a business point of view, you can have another implementation which is even more sophisticated. So you can have one risk-shield instance that is basically implementing both the authentication and the authorization channel in one instance. And there you're not only able to forward the information from the authentication to the authorization stream, but on top of that, you're also able to exchange so-called in-memory profiles between those two channels. So I will quickly explain afterwards what it's actually about. But you can imagine that we are collecting in-memory profiles which are characteristic for cardholder and merchant behavior, and this information can be exchanged between those channels without having to, for example, having to propagate then later on authorization information also to the authentication stream. This is, from a business point of view, a very interesting approach. So I will then further on I will explain what the risk-based solution is about and what role it can play in this context of risk-based authentication and also integration between authentication and authorization business. So basically the solution consists of 3 building blocks which are really crucial to the risk-based authentication and fraud prevention use case. So you have a data source configuration building block. So the risk solution integrates very easily with any kind of data streams you want to connect, as shown also before in the architecture slide. On top of that, you have a decision logic building block, where you have this dynamic profiling mechanism combined with fuzzy logic in scorecard models, or you can also use the dynamic profiling combination with machine learned models for risk analytics. And on top of that, the third important building block is to have risk and fraud analysis. So you can feedback the system with your fraud feedback. You can perform rule performance analysis. You can have dashboarding reporting engines to inform you about the quality of your overall model. And those 3 building blocks we have available. And I would like to quickly go deeper into the point of dynamic profiling. So this is the core part and the core functionality in the whole risk sheet setup. So when you think about the RBA context, no matter whether you're thinking about issuing or acquiring, it's more here. The example is a bit more about issuing. So what we are doing there with these in-memory profiles, we're basically building a digital fingerprint of the customers, and also profiling on IP address level, device level, also shipping address level or merchant level, what typical user behavior is, and what is not typical user behavior. And all this is done in risk sheets in a real-time evaluation within milliseconds. So the next slide shows you. So whenever you detect anything which is suspicious along this way of digital fingerprinting, you are just able to initiate a strong customer authentication in order to get the customer challenge being done. So the question is now, what kind of profiling are we actually doing, and how does this facilitate this whole risk-based authentication process? So when you're looking at the issuing perspective, you're mainly interested in cardholder behavior. So we are actually determining kind of a graph, a kind of a network between cardholder and other entities that he usually uses. So we correlate cardholders with merchants or merchant categories that are typically used by him, correlated to IP addresses and IP locations, also to device identifiers or device fingerprints or device characteristics. On top of that, you also have email addresses and shipping addresses, depending on whether you are ordering physical goods or digital goods. And on top of that, we are also profiling, for example, what typical times of the day are for the cardholder, and also fraud feedbacks coming from different channels. We are profiling that for cards, but also for other entities. So we also, for example, determining when an IP or device hotspot in terms of fraud marks is occurring. That's the issuing perspective. Now coming to the acquiring perspective. So when it's about profiling merchants, you may have some trouble. So when you think about what we did for the card, when you do that merchant centric, you have thousands of cards and thousands of different IPs and IP locations and devices and device fingerprints coming to your merchant. So it's pretty difficult to deduce any information from that and to build profiles like in the issuing for the cardholder behavior. So all this might become a bit challenging, and the answer to that is basically you have to build statistical profiles. So we can in real time determine, for example, decline in fraud rates per merchant. And we can compute those statistics in real time. We can also evaluate those statistics in real time. And if you think a bit more closely about that, you will figure out that for bigger merchants, even this is the statistical analysis is not even sufficient, because for example, if you have an increase in the fraud rate, you may not detect it at all because it's compared to all the transaction volume, it's not enough, or you may detect it way too late when the fraud rate is above a certain threshold. You may already have collected hundreds of fraud transactions, or also decline transactions. And the core idea here is in these statistics to build peer groups in order to do anomaly detection and in order to reduce the step-up rates in the end. So here in this example, you just split up the statistic by locations, and you analyze what is a high decline rate in a certain region, and how is that compared to another region, and how is that compared maybe to another region in another time period. Such peer groups analysis we are doing, and this way you can do anomaly detections even for very big merchants over longer periods of time. That's it so far from my end. Roger?
Well, thank you, Marcus. Very interesting insights into the risk world and risk profiling. So yeah, let's come to the key findings. Try to not lose too much time on that. Keep it short. So our key findings of today's webinar are: first, we are convinced that the end-to-end risk management approach allows best user experience and at the same time as little friction as possible. We are also convinced that the end-to-end risk management approach sharpens the accuracy of fraud tools and therefore reduces fraud in e-commerce. Furthermore, we see it as of utmost importance that the data is passed as best as possible, that the data is key point. So the more data available, the better the risk profiling can be done. So every stakeholder has an active part in the growing digital commerce and has a certain responsibility. And yes, I think what is also very important is that we do not forget the cardholders, the customers, so that they are really informed and they really have fun and with doing e-commerce in the future. Okay, so short information about Inform, etc. And I think we will start with one slide about Inform, and I pass back here again to Marcus.
Yeah, so who is Inform? Inform is an expert in hybrid digital decision systems, located in Aachen, Germany, with more than 850 employees, mostly located in Europe, but also in the US and in Australia. We are a privately owned software company which has been profitable over the past 33 years. We have overall sustainability objectives, and the fact that we've been profitable over the last 33 years is basically connected to the fact that we are diversified in many different markets and many different solutions.
Okay, then a few words to Netcetera. So we are a leading and independent Swiss software company. We have been established in 1996 in Zurich, in Switzerland. In the meanwhile, we have many locations all around in Europe, but also in Middle East and in Asia Pacific. We are providing and innovative software solutions for many industries and many customers, covering the entire life cycle. And we do that to reliably reach the digital business targets for our customers on an engaging journey. Maybe a few words to the partnership with Inform and etc. I think this is interesting because I think we are now in this partnership since say over 5 years now, and we are quite successful, especially in the DACH region, with our common product approaches. And I think this is based especially on our shared strategy that both companies have. So on the one side, it's the shared strategy, of course, in being a high quality IT solution provider. And we also have kind of the same customer targets in the e-commerce. So we support banks, issuers, acquirers, processors with tailor-made products. And we are also sharing the strategy in being up to date regarding new payment trends and involving regulations. For example, here, Etc. is also a technical associate within the MVCO consortium. And last but not least, we see that we both companies share their company culture, which is very flexible, adaptable, and also very agile. Okay, so then before we jump into the Q&A session, and the good thing is we still have 10 minutes left, I promised you to publish the results that we asked you in the beginning of the webinar. So I will publish now the result of poll 1 so that everyone can see them, hopefully. So shortly about the results. So the question was, what role does your company play in e-commerce? And we see it's quite balanced. So we have representatives from all the industry players here in that webinar. On rank 1, it's the payment service providers with a little bit more than 30%, but we also have risk providers, participants from risk companies, and also from bank issuing side. We also have the acquiring side here in that webinar, and a little bit less from the merchant side. Then I will also publish the results from the second poll. Hopefully you can see them. So the question there was, what is currently your greatest challenge in e-commerce? And here we see quite a clear rank 1 position, which is balancing security and user convenience. Of course, we also see this as the biggest challenge today in e-commerce. Because also in regards to the PSD2 regulation, I think this is definitely one of the biggest challenge for the whole industry. But also the other 4 answers are given quite balanced. So I think, we see that all of these 5 answers are really challenges that all of you are confronted with. So thanks again for answering on this. It's very interesting, and I think now then we come to the Q&A session, and I can give back the word to Alex. Maybe you can start with that.
Sure. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Marcus. I think you've taken and explained an extremely complex objective extremely well. And as you mentioned, Roger, there's some very interesting insights from the both of you. So first of all, from my perspective, I want to thank you for taking a very complex situation and explaining it so well. We do have time for a few questions, and we do have a few questions. So I think in interest of time, let's just get moving with those straight away. And I guess the first one is for you, Marcus. Do clients have configuration options for acquirers or issuers when using the Inform solution, or are they bound to specifications or best practice implementations?
Well, I would say the customers that are willing to dig into that solution are really able to configure everything they want. They have full insight into the solution. They can simulate and optimize rules, and they can have rule performance charts to see the performance of each individual rule. But they can also stick a bit to already established setup and parameterize it only in a minor way with fewer requirements they have.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on. So Roger, how can merchants or PSPs provide more data for the payment process?
Well, thanks for that question. Indeed, a very important and good question. So I see two things here. So we know that in the new 3D Secure 2.x protocol, there is much more data fields as data points as in the old 1.0 standard. However, the large part of these data fields in 2.x are specified as optional data fields, and therefore not all of the merchants are using these data fields and fill them with data and to provide this data, this optional data to acquirers and issuers. So there we see quite a high potential to improve this data flow by using also these optional data fields in 3ds 2.x. Another aspect, and furthermore, also the PSPs can help on that side, because PSPs that are normally the operators of the 3ds server components that is needed to start with the 3D Secure process. They can also provide additional data, such as information about the user's device, which also clearly could add value to the risk profiling. And because in 3ds 2.x device data gathering, this is defined in the protocol as part of the protocol message called the 3ds method, which is of course also an optional call from the 3ds server component. But also here the same situation. When this is not used, there is missing data regarding the devices, and we really suggest also PSPs to activate this functionality on 3ds server side to gather also the device data and also pass that device information further to acquirers and issuers. So I think there are definitely possibilities on merchant and PSP side to provide more data into the payment process, yes.
Okay. Marcus, anything to add to that?
Maybe a quick additional comment on that. So the one question is about how a merchant PSP can provide more data, but from our experience, you can also ask the question how you can encourage the merchant PSPs to provide more accurate data. So we're seeing a lot of data which is already populated, but which could be more accurate, and which, in order to really facilitate the data analytics process at the risk provider's end.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Again, probably for you, Roger, to begin with. What role does behavioral biometrics play in the payments process, please?
Well, another good question. I know there are approaches, or there are existing approaches to use behavioral biometry as a second factor, for example, for strong customer authentication. However, this is maybe not so easy to implement with regard to the 3D Secure authentication. Because of the fact that the user's touch points on 3DS are quite limited, and maybe will be more limited in the future, because for example with an OTP, one-time password authentication, here the user only inputs the one-time password into a 3DS screen, so that's the only touch point there. But when we look at out of band, or especially also regards frictionless transaction, then there is no user action at all directly with the 3DS system. So there it needs to really be proven how good biometric authentication can be implemented in 3DS authentication. On the other side, and this is my opinion, in my view, behavioral biometrics has a very high potential on merchant side. So because in online shops there are much more data touch points from the user in the web shop, and this makes it much easier to calculate the behavioral biometry score, and which on the other side then enables the merchants to leverage these biometrics risk scores to before processing a transaction, of course, to decide whether the merchant wants to send it through 3DS or if he can trust this biometric score to send the transaction outside of the 3DS rails to avoid the step up with strong customer authentication.
Okay, thank you. Marcus, again, anything to add to that?
No, I think this was perfectly fine.
Okay, we have I've got time for one more. So to build statistical profiles, e.g. by merchant per group, are you effectively using data captured from various clients as opposed to it being limited to individual client data? Probably one for Marcus to begin with there.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, that's an interesting point. I would say it depends a bit on the customer setup. So whenever it's from a legal point of view possible to share this information among different customers, we do that, and we can do that. When the legal regulations don't allow you to share the data, then we can simply do that. But there are definitely implementations when you're looking at the processor point of view, where such statistical data is then shared over different issuers that are serving, which are all end customers of those processors.
Okay, thank you, Marcus. Okay, gents. Well, look, we've reached the hour mark. As I said before, an extremely interesting, in-depth, and well-explained topic and webinar. So, from payment card and mobile perspective, thank you both very much for that, and thank you to the audience for tuning in and listening. As mentioned before, all of this will be made available shortly after the end of this. And please feel free to share it with your colleagues or listen to and review back at your leisure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome.